Hey Optimancers, Treantmonk here. So we're going to get into our second level spells for Wizard today. And just to remind people or new viewers, this is how I rate these spells. So I'm going to color code each spell, and that color coding is going to be my rating. If I color code it red, that means I don't think it's a great spell, or I don't think it works the way it should. If I color code it orange, then that means I think it could be good in the right circumstances, but because it is so circumstantial, I don't think it necessarily warrants you putting a preparation slot into it. If I color code it purple, I think it's a decent spell. Decent selection, maybe not your best selection, but it's not a bad one. And if I color code it green, I think it's a good selection. This is a spell that I'm often going to prepare for my wizards. And if I color code it blue, then I think it's a standout spell. This is a spell that I'm almost always going to have and almost always going to prepare for my wizards. Now you might notice that some of these rankings are going to be a little bit different than you see in my wizard guide if you have read that. And that's because years have passed and some of my opinions on these spells have changed. So, that said, let's get started. So I will be putting the spell right here, and I will also put a reference so that if you want to know where you can find the spell in your player's handbook or your Xanathar's guide, you'll know where to find it. And I'm going to be doing the spells by their school. So we're going to start with the Abjuration school, and there's only one Abjuration spell at second level, and that's Arcane Lock. And Arcane Lock is just not a spell I'm ever going to take or prepare if I'm a wizard in a standard kind of adventure. Arcane Lock is more for if you have, say, a wizard tower and you want to have the doors locked for everyone except for you and your allies, then Arcane Lock is a spell that you would want to set that up with. But in terms of having a wizard who's going to be exploring dungeons or the wilderness or sailing or any of the things that you normally see in D&D, you're not going to find Arcane Lock to be very useful for you. So let's get into our Conjuration spells. And there are a lot of good Conjuration spells at second level. And one thing I want to note too is if you are a Conjurer and you're 6th level or higher, these spells will also restore your Benign Transposition ability. So there's a double use for taking them if you are a Conjurer. Now my favorite Conjuration spell at second level is Web. And the reason Web is my favorite spell at second level is because it does the kind of thing that I expect spells to do as I level up. And that is take an area of enemies and have them all make saving throws, and then you kind of do the divide and conquer thing. So some of them make their save and they're not affected by the spell, and then some don't make their save and then they're restrained in the area. Now they can use a strength check to break out of that area, but that strength check, it's not a saving throw, so it can be affected with things like Hex. And also, it takes their action, so it would prevent them from attacking. So the idea of a spell like Web or Hypnotic Pattern or any of those other kinds of spells is that we're going to take a group of enemies and maybe have 8 enemies, and instead of fighting 8 at once and taking 8 attacks at once, they're going to trickle through. So you're going to get maybe 4 of them that made their save, and then 4 of them are restrained. So then you deal with those 4, and as the other ones make their saves and come out, you can deal with them 1 or 2 at a time. Or if you get in a situation where you happen to trap all your enemies, or all your enemies are trapped in the web, then they are restrained. That means they're getting disadvantage on their attacks, you're getting advantage on your attacks against them. So this combines really well with something like ranged attacks. Now, a web, if you want it to have the full height, requires anchor points, so it can be done in like a hallway to actually fill the hallway. But in most cases, you're going to be using it what they call layering on the floor. So you have a 2-dimensional map, and that's most of the time in D&D we're playing on a 2-dimensional map. So you have a floor, and then it covers the area, but it's only 5 feet high, which is fine in most cases. Unless you're dealing with flying enemies, you're going to find that covering the floor area works just fine. So there's not big limitations on where you can put a web spell. You can't put it in the middle of the air. It's got to be against something, but that's usually not a big deal. Now, one disadvantage of this spell is, technically speaking, a creature's getting 2 attempts to get out of it every turn, because they're getting their saving throw and then they can make their strength check. But the strength check does use their action, but still, that's 2 chances to get out of the effect. So that's a bit of a disadvantage. But one thing that is an advantage is the restrained condition causes disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. So that saving throw they get every round, after the initial save is failed, follow-up saves will have disadvantage. One other thing I should probably mention about Web is that I've noticed that because it has both a target on strength and dexterity, usually creatures are good at one of those. So we will find that this isn't a super reliable way of locking down enemies. But again, if you're dealing with groups of enemies, some are going to fail, and then you are technically getting the effect that you want from this spell. Now, this doesn't stack up to the spells that do similar things at higher levels, but really, when we're talking about second level spells, it's really your only option for doing that kind of effect. And it's really your first step into that God Wizard style of playing. So I'm pretty much always going to have it at level 3. Once I get to higher levels, it may not be worth the preparation slot if I have better spells that do similar kinds of things. But there's still an advantage to keeping it prepared at those higher levels just because it uses that lower level slot. So it's kind of in between for me, but at 3rd level, definitely having Web. And then maybe at 5th or 7th level, I may not be preparing it anymore. My second favorite Conjuration spell at 2nd level is Misty Step. So Misty Step is our first teleport spell. And because it uses a bonus action, that means we can still use our action in combination with a Misty Step. But keep in mind, and this is something that I've thought about more the more I've played, is that those bonus action spells are not free, right? Because as soon as you cast a bonus action spell, any other spell you cast on that round can only be a cantrip. So you can't combine this with casting another decent spell. You can only combine it with a cantrip. But keep in mind, you can also combine it with things like the dodge action or a hide action. So it's not like you can't do anything other than a cantrip if you do a Misty Step. Keep that in mind. Now, one kind of wizard that definitely wants Misty Step, I think, is an enchanter. Because if you are an enchanter, you have Hypnotic Gaze. And one of the most important things about Hypnotic Gaze is getting into position. And Misty Step can be combined with Hypnotic Gaze because Hypnotic Gaze is not casting a spell. So they work well together. So if you're an enchanter, I'm definitely taking Misty Step, 100%. For any other wizard, I think it is a good maneuverability spell. And at the lower levels, you have a limited number of maneuverability spells. Now, if I have something like Expeditious Retreat, maybe I'm going to have a bit of redundancy there. So I'm going to pick one or the other for my preparation slots, but I'm definitely going to be considering Misty Step with any wizard. My next favorite Conjuration spell is a straight-out blast spell, and these aren't my favorite kinds of spells in general, but I do like the Flaming Sphere spell. Now, it doesn't do a lot of damage. 2d6 damage, save for half. So that's 7 points of damage or 3 to 4 points of damage on a save, which isn't good damage. But because it's using your bonus action every round, we can combine it with something like crappy cantrip damage. So you take your crappy cantrip damage plus your crappy Flaming Sphere damage, and suddenly you're doing okay damage. And wizards aren't great at doing damage, especially to single targets. So we can use Flaming Sphere to shore that up a bit, and so we can fulfill a role in the party we normally wouldn't be able to fill. The other thing is because it is continuous damage, it ends up being a fair amount of damage by the time the spell is over. Now, one combination I really like with Flaming Sphere is if we combine it with the Booming Blade, because we can use our bonus action every round to do damage with the Flaming Sphere, but if a creature ends its turn next to the Flaming Sphere, it takes additional damage. Now, that's very seldom going to happen in combat, because what creature is going to choose to end its turn beside the Flaming Sphere? Well, occasionally, tactically, they have nowhere they can go. Maybe you've cornered them or something. But then also, if you use it with a Booming Blade, so you hit them with a Booming Blade, and then you hit them with the Flaming Sphere, so you've already done okay damage, and then that creature really has no options. If they move to get away from the Flaming Sphere, they're going to take the Booming Blade secondary damage, and if they don't move to avoid the Booming Blade secondary damage, then they're going to take the Flaming Sphere damage. So those two spells tend to work really well together. So if I have Booming Blade, and I use Booming Blade because maybe I'm a Blade Singer, or I'm an Abjuration Wizard that does melee, or maybe there's another party member that uses Booming Blade, then Flaming Sphere is additionally attractive because of how it combines. Now we go a long way down before we get to my next favorite Conjuration spell, which is Cloud of Daggers. And the thing about Cloud of Daggers is it has no save, which is okay, and it continues after your initial casting, which is okay, but it is using your concentration and it can't move. So creatures will normally move out of the effect, so they're only going to normally take 1 round of damage. Uh, Cloud of Daggers, however, can be useful if you are in a tactical situation where maybe you have a choke point or a hallway that creatures have to move through. Then you could potentially use Cloud of Daggers to either control the battlefield or inflict a lot of damage. So there are circumstances where this spell would be really effective, which is why I'm going to give it the orange rating. But in terms of just using it as a straight out blast spell, I think it's red for that. I think there's certain situations where it is pretty effective. My least favorite Conjuration spell at 2nd level by far is Dust Devil. And if I had a rating lower than red, Dust Devil would get it. Dust Devil is normally the kind of spell I like because we're talking about doing damage as well as moving enemies against their will. Those two things combined with a lasting effect is normally something I would like, but the mechanics here don't support what it should do because a creature has to end its turn next to the effect for any of these things to happen. And just like I said with Flaming Sphere, that's generally not going to happen. Except a Flaming Sphere, we can use our bonus action on our turn to actually do damage. Dust Devil, we can't really do anything with it. We can move it, but it's not doing anything unless creatures are ending their turn next to it. And they're just not going to be doing that most of the time. So most of the time, Dust Devil's going to do nothing. Nothing at all. So I really don't like Dust Devil. I think it's a terrible spell. It reads reasonably well. When you read the description of the spell and the things it does, those are things that generally I like. But because the mechanics make it so hard for this to work, I don't like it at all. So this brings us to our divination spells. And the first spell I'm going to talk about, my favorite divination spell, is See Invisibility. Now, See Invisibility is, by definition, circumstantial, because if there's nothing invisible, then there's no point in you using this spell. But when you need See Invisibility, you really need See Invisibility. Now, See Invisibility does not use your concentration, so if you have an invisible enemy, you can use See Invisibility so that you can see them, and then on the next round, you can do a spell against that creature that would require your concentration, and you'll be fine. Now, that's a 2-round setup, so keep that in mind. But, like I said, if you're facing an invisible enemy, you really, really are going to want See Invisibility. So I'm going to give it a purple rating despite the fact that it is circumstantial, because I think invisibility happens enough in campaigns that if you don't have See Invisibility or any way to see an invisible creature, you're going to really feel that when you need it. My next favorite divination spell is Locate Object. Now, Locate Object sounds like a super useful spell. The one limitation I've found that seems to come up when I play is the range isn't that big. So if you're, say, in a city and you're looking for a certain item, it's not going to help you that much because the city's so big you can't possibly cover it with a Locate Object spell. You're just going to cover a tiny area of that city. So unless you already know where you need to be looking, it may not work for you. Now, it can work reasonably well if you're in a smaller location, like a dungeon or an adventuring area. Now, obviously, this spell is going to be circumstantial because there's not always a case where you're looking for a specific item, and you need to be familiar with that item beforehand. So it's not like you can use it to find maybe there's a magic item in the area. That's not the kind of thing Locate Object does. It's if you're looking for something specific. Now, sometimes the goals of an adventure are to look for something specific, and then Locate Object is going to be a lot of help to you. But that, again, is not every adventure, and often campaigns will go by where that may never be an adventure. My next favorite divination spell is Detect Thoughts. Again, Detect Thoughts is a circumstantial spell, but in those right circumstances, I think it's a pretty good spell. And there's a couple circumstances it's useful. The first one is if you are questioning a creature, Detect Thoughts is a great way, without a saving throw, to ensure they're telling the truth, because you can probe their surface thoughts. So if they're lying to you, they're probably thinking about how they're hiding some real information, and you'll know that right away. Now, if you want to probe deeper into their thoughts to know what maybe isn't on the surface thoughts, then they would get a saving throw. But for the base use of the spell, there's no saving throw, and you can switch targets. So if you are questioning multiple creatures, you can use Detect Thoughts on one, and then switch it to the other one. The other use of this spell is to find hidden creatures, so you can probe for thoughts of maybe hidden or invisible creatures near you, The range is only 30 feet, and it doesn't allow you to actually see them. It just allows you to know location. So there are some pretty hefty limitations on that use of the spell, but it does give you another option for using the spell. So both those things are pretty circumstantial. The first one I find really good, though. I actually think it is a better truth detector than Zone of Truth, because Zone of Truth is going to give a saving throw right away. Well, with Detect Thoughts, we can avoid the saving throw altogether. My least favorite divination spell at second level is Mind Spike. So what Mind Spike does is it's a blast spell, so you choose an enemy and it takes 3d8 damage or half that on a successful save. So that is not good damage for this level, especially with a single target spell. And it doesn't do additional damage after that, but it does allow you to know where that enemy is, even if they turn invisible or even if they go out of your line of sight. But it does use your concentration. So if you use this spell and you're concentrating to know where that creature is, then you're going to be pretty limited in what you can do to that creature because all the other concentration spells are no longer available to you. So we're not getting the same effect from this that we would get from, say, a Invisibility spell. Now, the good thing, I guess, about Mind Spike is it's not circumstantial. We can always use a blast, and a diviner at 6th level or higher can cast a spell and they will get a spell slot back for it. So somewhat useful there. I still don't think it's a good enough blast spell for a diviner to be using, especially considering it's using up your concentration as well. The scaling of this spell also isn't great. It's an additional d8 per level. That's better than scaling from a lot of spells, but it's still not enough to make this spell worthwhile or do worthwhile damage for any level you cast it at. Now, when it comes to the divining spells, with the exception of Mind Spike, I do think that they're all spells that are reasonably useful to have regardless of your level, but not necessarily worthy of a preparation slot unless you know that you're going to need them. So let's get into our enchantment spells, and my favorite enchantment spell is a runaway. It's Suggestion. And Suggestion, and I've talked about this before, Suggestion is somewhat DM dependent because some DMs are going to be very conservative on what they allow you to do with it, some middle of the road, and some are very liberal with what they're going to allow you to do with it. Those that are liberal with what they allow you to do with it, this spell becomes kind of broken because you could use it to, say, convince an enemy to become your ally, and then you basically have a free ally. But even the conservative DMs are going to let you do things like suggest that someone go far away, that they should run away and save themselves. And that removes them from the battle, and there's only one saving throw here. So this is a spell that combines very well if you are a diviner and you have Portent to make them automatically fail their saving throw because there's only the one save. So once they fail that save, this spell is going to be very effective for you. Naturally, there's also going to be some out-of-combat use for a spell like Suggestion, and those are circumstantial, and they're numerous enough that I can't really give a list here, but generally, you want somebody to do something or do you a favor, and you can use a Suggestion spell as a way to ensure that they do it. But in terms of combat use, generally it's about removing an enemy from a combat. And that's, again, a divide and conquer kind of thing. Doesn't work so well if there's like a horde of enemies. This is more for either a single tough target or a small number of tougher targets. Now, with Suggestion, they need to be able to understand you, but you are not restricted to humanoid only, like something like a charm person. And a lot of the creatures we're going to be facing in combat will be able to understand us, but aren't humanoid. So it is good for that as well. Now, I'm not a big fan of the other two enchantment spells. The first one I'll talk about is Hold Person. Now, Hold Person is a spell that, in the right circumstances, it could be hugely effective. So I might normally rate it orange, except it's also not the kind of spell I particularly like because it is a single target spell. If they make their save, nothing happens. So then you've wasted your action and you've wasted your spell slot. Now, if they fail their save, it's huge because they're paralyzed. And paralyzed, of course, is the worst condition in the game you can have other than being dead. And if you are paralyzed, you can expect to be dead very soon. But another thing I don't like about the Hold Person spell is it's only usable on humanoids. So that limits the number of creatures that can be affected by it. Plus, it's a single target spell. Plus, it's going to be a save or nothing happens. And even if it does work, they get a saving throw every round. So there's a lot of things that I don't like about this spell. And you put them all together, and I'm not sure I'd even consider it circumstantial. I consider it a spell that could be super effective in the exact right circumstance, but not for sure. It is a gambling kind of spell, and I'm not big on the gambling kind of spells. I want spells that I can be reasonably certain are going to be effective, and Hold Person is not one of those spells. The other enchantment spell that's left is Crown of Madness. Crown of Madness, in a lot of ways, is like Hold Person. First off, like Hold Person, it's only usable on humanoids, so that's a big problem right away. The second thing is, like Hold Person, it's a single target spell that if they make their save, nothing happens. Now, if they don't make their save, what happens is you can have them use their action to attack a creature of your choice. And that's really good. But if there's no one in their reach, then they can act normally on their turn. So if the circumstances are wrong, this spell could really backfire on you. And even if you use the creature's action to make an attack on a creature of your choice, that creature still gets their move and bonus actions unhindered and unaffected by this spell. So between this spell and Hold Person, don't know. I mean, if you can make this spell work right, it's even better to have an enemy attacking other enemies. But on the other hand, they're getting movement, they're getting bonus actions, and if there's no one in their reach, they can act normally. So these two spells, kind of a toss-up for me. I'm not a big fan of either of them. So let's get into our evocation spells, and I'm not a huge fan of the evocation spells. Even with blasting, I think your best blast with second level spells is a Conjuration spell. So there's not a whole lot here. The first spell I do want to talk about, and probably my favorite evocation spell at second level, is Darkness. Now, Darkness is going to fulfill a very similar role to what we would have seen Fog Cloud do at first level. Now, there's two major advantages to Darkness over Fog Cloud. The first is that you can move the effect. So you could cast it on an object, and then as that object moves, the darkness moves with it. And that is tactically very useful, because often you'll put an effect like that in a certain place, and then enemies maybe move around so that they can see. And then if you can't move it, then you might as well just drop your concentration because it's not doing anything anymore. But with the darkness, you could just move it into the appropriate area so it's still effective. The other advantage of this spell is there's certain allies that may be able to see through it, such as a Warlock with Devil's Sight. And if you combine it with something like a Sorlock, and a Sorlock is often going to use a darkness spell in combination with their Eldritch Blast and then their Quickened Eldritch Blast to be able to do a lot of attacks with advantage for a lot of damage. So if we are working with a Sorlock, it could be a very good way to add damage to that Warlock. If you cast the darkness spell on them, then they can concentrate on something else, like say a hex spell, which could increase their damage even more. And the damage you increase by may be more damage than any damage you could do as a wizard. Now there are some disadvantages to darkness over Fog Cloud. The first is the duration isn't as good. The second is the range isn't as good. And the third is that the area is not as big. So darkness, I think, is a better spell than Fog Cloud, but I don't think it's a lot better spell than Fog Cloud, unless we have that situation where we have allies who maybe could see through the effect. Still, as a battlefield control, at this level, it's not too bad. Am I going to continue Darkness at higher levels? With a wizard, almost certainly not. If I was playing something like a Sorlock, that's very different, but with a wizard, I don't think Darkness really delivers considering it's using your concentration at higher levels. It's a decent spell for level 3 wizard or level 4 wizard. By level 5, I'm probably looking to get it off my preparation list. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Shatter. Now, Shatter is a area of effect blast spell, and as far as area of effect blast spells go, I don't think it's great, but it's probably the best one you get at second level. Now, it does 3d8 damage, which is the same damage you would expect from an upcast Thunderwave. It also does thunder damage and provides a Constitution saving throw, same as Thunderwave, except without the knockback effect. But Shatter can be cast at range, and it has a much bigger area of effect, so we can hit a lot more enemies with it, which means that, in essence, we are going to be doing more damage with it. Now, Shatter will also do damage to non-magical items that aren't being carried or worn that are in the spell area. And this can be a good thing, and it could be a bad thing. It really depends what those things are. I mean, you might destroy some of your treasure. On the other hand, you might destroy something that might be useful to your opponent. So that one's kind of a mix for me. But in terms of just straight out blast for the area, this is okay for the level. It's not great damage, but it's not terrible. But it definitely doesn't scale well. This is a spell that is okay at level 3 and level 4. By level 5, this is definitely not going to be worth a spot on your spell list. When we compare it to what's coming up, like with Fireball, this really does not compare well at all. My next favorite evocation spell at 2nd level is Warding Wind. So what Warding Wind does is it creates this kind of whirlwind around you in a 10-foot radius around the caster. And then what it does is ranged attacks against you have disadvantage. It might deafen creatures around you, creates difficult terrain around you. So there's a number of reasonably useful defensive abilities here. One of the big problems with this spell is it does have friendly fire. So if we have an ally next to us, we might deafen them, and we make it harder for them to move. So there are problems with having this spell if we are near our allies, which we often are. But if you are, say, back from a combat and your allies are up front, that may not be a problem at all. Now, being attacked with ranged weapons, being charged in melee where 10 feet of difficult terrain will save you, both those things are somewhat circumstantial, so I don't think this is a great defensive spell. But if we can position ourselves where maybe melee isn't a concern and the biggest concern are things like arrows and that kind of thing, then Warding Wind is a good way to provide yourself some defense. But it is using your concentration. I don't think it's the best defensive spell at this level. I don't even know if it's in the top 2. When I look at spells like Blur even, against Warding Wind, I'm probably thinking the Blur is the better of the 2. So Warding Wind's just a little too circumstantial for me. But not a bad spell, but just there are better options for doing similar kinds of things. Now, I should also mention there are a couple circumstantial uses here as well. We can extinguish flames with it. We can disperse fogs and mists with this. So there's certain cases where Warding Wind is the spell to get a job done. But again, those are very circumstantial. The next spell I want to talk about is Gust of Wind. Gust of Wind is a spell that I used to like, I think, more than I like it now. What it does is it creates a line that's 10 feet wide, 60 feet long that originates from the caster. And then creatures that start their turn in that effect, and it's using your concentration, then have to make a strength saving throw or they're knocked back 15 feet. And if they want to move towards you, that movement is halved. So my original thought was, well, this is a really good way to create a defense for yourself. So you can set up this Gust of Wind, and then creatures are being knocked back, and then they're only moving towards you at half rate. So it could keep them from ever getting near you. But I don't find it really works that way. First off, the fact that it uses your concentration is a problem, because if you're using your concentration on a defensive spell, there's not a lot of offensive things you're going to be able to do that are effective. The second thing is, because it's 10 feet wide, creatures can move around this effect. So they can often avoid that double movement to get towards you effect of this spell, unless they are in something like a hallway. So that creates an additional problem with this spell. The only time it's really going to be useful to you is if pushing your enemies is going to be a great thing to do, like they're on a bridge or near a cliff or somewhere where pushing them can put them in a bad spot. But there are other ways to accomplish this as well. Keep in mind, a Warlock can do this with their Eldritch Blast with an Invocation at no cost at all and without concentration. It's only 10 feet, but they may be able to do it multiple times in the same round. I just don't find Gust of Wind is useful enough of the time for me to give this a good rating, or do anything other than warn you that this spell is quite circumstantial. So let's get into the spells that I don't think are very good for Evocation. And the one that I think is the best of the worst is Scorching Ray. And I used to like Scorching Ray more, and I think I didn't think about it enough. I read the spell, 66 damage to a single target at level 2. That sounds like reasonably good damage. But if we do the math, I mean, we're making 3 attack rolls. How many of those are going to hit? Well, probably 2. So we're probably hitting twice. And how much damage is each one going to do? About 7 points of damage. So that's about 14 points of damage we could expect from this spell. Now, how much is a magic missile going to do if we upcast it as a 2nd level spell? 13 points of damage. Except that damage is more consistent and reliable. and it's force damage, which is better than fire damage because a lot less creatures are immune or resistant to it. So is it worth using a preparation slot and a second level spell to be able to do 1 point more damage, maybe on average, than we could already do with a magic missile spell, which also gives us the flexibility of casting it at level 1? I don't think at all. I can't see a good reason why I would take this spell over just using magic missile. So because it is so easily replaced by a better spell, I just wouldn't recommend it. Now, if you don't have magic missile and you're looking for a single target damage spell and something that doesn't use concentration, in those cases, okay, it's okay. But because it's just so easily replaced by a better spell, I can't recommend it. The next spell I want to talk about with Evocation is Continual Flame. And I've talked about Continual Flame before, and I have a number of issues here. The first is that it's easily replaced with a cantrip, and that's a big problem when a cantrip is competing with a second level spell. And keep in mind that cantrip is shedding more light than a continual light does. Now, I've heard people say, well, but you can put your continual light in your lamp, and then you have a lantern that you don't need oil for. But if we're going by the spell description, then we're not going to get nearly the range of light. In general, this is a light spell that delivers a poor radius of light, and that is a big problem when we have better spells that are cantrips. Now, one thing that was mentioned to me the last time I talked about this spell was you can use Continual Flame as a way to defeat a darkness spell. And because you can have Continual Flame permanently, you could just simply have a lantern in your backpack with a Continual Flame on it. And then when you come across a darkness spell, you have a way to get rid of it instantly. And yeah, that's pretty good. But how often are we facing darkness spells? Once in a while. So that's a pretty circumstantial use for this spell, but I'll give you that one. If you use it to defeat a darkness spell, that's not bad at all. But in general, the normal use of this spell is for light, and it's just not your best option. And your best option might be a cantrip. Or the other thing is, and I know this is a little bit crazy, but maybe you could just carry some oil and use a lantern. Now, a lantern can't necessarily function like underwater, like Continual Flame can, but most of the time we're not underwater. Most of the time a lantern is actually a really good way for a party to get a form of light that sheds light much further than a Continual Flame, further than a light spell, and can't be dispelled. Now let's get into some bad blast spells. And the first one I want to talk about is Melf's Acid Arrow. So Melf's Acid Arrow is doing acid damage, which is okay, but it does 64 damage, and not even all at once. It does 44 damage, and then an additional 2d4 damage at the end of the creature's turn, if it's still alive. So that's just not good damage. Now, the spell requires it to hit roll, and if you miss that to hit roll, it will take partial damage, but that's really bad damage, because now it's half of 4d4. So essentially 2d4 or 5 points of damage using a second level spell slot. So the damage just isn't good. Cantrips are very soon going to be doing more damage than you're going to get with this spell using a second level spell slot and your action. So I just don't think this spell measures up. It needs to do actually a fair bit more damage before I would recommend this spell. The next spell is Aganazzar's Scorcher. So what it does is it creates a 30-foot line, and any creature in that line makes a saving throw where they take 3d8 fire damage, or half on a failed save. And why don't I like this spell? Well, because if we're talking about area of effect spells that do 3d8 damage, this is just straight inferior to Shatter. Shatter's going to cover so many more squares, and you can fire it at range, which means there's so many more cases where you're going to be able to hit so many more creatures with that spell. This spell, you're going to be challenged to hit more than 2 creatures most of the time. So you're not doing good damage, and you're not hitting a lot of creatures with it. So it's not a good spell. But the worst damage spell for Evocation at second level is Snilloc's Snowball Storm. Now, this is a spell that came out after the player's handbook, and I don't know where they got these numbers from. 3d6 damage in a tiny area, that's Burning Hands. But this is a second level spell slot. Now, it can be cast at range, but when we look at spells like Shatter, it just does more damage than this spell over a much bigger area, doing a better type of damage. So this has the disadvantage of doing a poor type of damage because cold is not uncommonly resisted or immune. and tiny area, 5-foot radius. So we're talking about 4 squares for 3d6 damage, when the standard for area of effect at this level is 3d8. So why they decide to make the damage lower as well as the radius lower, there's no reason. There's no advantage to the spell to justify why they made it a smaller area with less damage. So it's just a terrible area of effect damage spell. So let's move onward to our illusion spells. And the first illusion spell, and my favorite illusion spell for 2nd level, is Mirror Image. Mirror Image is going to create 3 duplicates of you, and then whenever you're targeted with an attack, then you make a roll on a d20, and if the roll is high enough, one of the mirror images is hit instead of you. And then that difficulty gets higher as you lose those images. But the things about mirror image are that, number 1, it doesn't use your concentration, so it's a way of layering up defenses. And number 2, whether you succeed on that d20 or not, if you're attacked enough times, this will eventually take 3 attacks and turn them into automatic misses. So that could be 3 concentration saves that now you don't have to make. And Mirror Image is going to continue to be effective at higher levels. I've been challenged on that. I've heard people say Mirror Image isn't worth it at higher tiers of play, but I really find it is. It's not a big investment at higher levels, a 2nd level spell slot, and you're still turning 3 attacks into automatic misses. And instead of attacks that do 10 points of damage, there are attacks that do 50 points of damage. So it is having a bigger effect as we move up in levels. So this is a spell that I'm probably going to be taking at level 3, and then I will continue to prepare it even at high level of play. Now, because it uses an action, I'm not always going to be casting this in combat. Sometimes I want to be casting something offensive in combat rather than defensive in combat because I need to contribute. But any time where I have a chance to prepare beforehand, Mirror Image is just a no-brainer. Always throw on a Mirror Image. Why not? Now at 3rd level, that 2nd level spell slot is somewhat valuable, but I'm still going to be casting it if I get the chance before a combat because, again, that other spell I cast is probably going to be a concentration spell, and that Mirror Image is going to help me keep that up. My second favorite illusion spell at 2nd level is Invisibility, because Invisibility, I probably don't have to explain why Invisibility is useful. It prevents you from being seen. Now, in 5th edition, there's no mechanic for them not knowing where you are with an invisibility spell. An invisibility spell gives you the opportunity to make a hide check. It doesn't replace your hide check. So by the rules, casting invisibility, the enemies still know where you are. But because they can't see you, any attacks against you would have disadvantage. Furthermore, if you do want to hide, you now have the ability to do so. And finally, you can't be targeted with anything that requires them seeing you, which is a number of things, including a lot of devastating spells. Of course, out of combat, invisibility comes up all the time. Like when we're doing sneaking or break and entering, trying to steal something, that invisibility is always going to be useful in those situations. It's such an iconic spell, I don't feel like I need to provide you a lot of examples. You must know how invisibility works and how useful it can be. Now we get into our OK spells, and the first one I'm going to talk about is Blur. I used to give Blur a higher rating than this, but the more I've played the game and the more I've realized the limitations of the concentration mechanic, more I've realized that Blur, although it's reasonably effective, that use of concentration prevents you from being an effective caster. And that's, of course, a massive problem. You can be a blaster and combine it with Blur, but in general, your battlefield controls, your debuffs, your buffs, they all use your concentration. So if you're concentrating on a Blur spell, you can't do any of those things. When it comes to the straight out defense of this spell, it's pretty much as good as improved invisibility because it's turning all attacks against you into attacks with disadvantage, which is a great way to avoid damage. But Mirror Image, I just think, is going to be always better because of the concentration mechanic. Now, if I am playing a character that blasts, like I'm an Evoker, then Blur might be a little more reasonable. And remember, we could combine Blur and Mirror Image. There's no reason we couldn't do that if we want to layer our defenses. And then if we're throwing things like fireballs, then Blur might be a good spell to be worthy of our concentration. Next spell I want to talk about is Shadowblade. Some people are really crazy about this spell. They love this spell. I don't think it's that great, and the reason I don't think it's great is because, number one, it's using your concentration, and that's a huge problem. Number two, I don't think the damage is all that impressive. And number three, we're not always replacing items that aren't magical already. I know that generally when we do builds and we talk about builds, we keep magic items off the table. And I mean, there are probably certain campaigns where you don't get magic items at all. But I think the most common play involves PCs getting magic items, usually starting around 3rd level, and then by 5th level or 7th level, most of the martial characters are going to have a magic weapon. That magic weapon is going to involve a bonus to hit and a bonus to damage. So when you use a Shadow Blade to replace that weapon, we're not replacing a regular 1d8 weapon. We are replacing a weapon that was maybe 1d8 +1 +1 to hit, with a weapon that doesn't provide a bonus to hit. So then the damage increase from that Shadow Blade is reduced. Now I will say that Shadow Blade scales reasonably well, because if we're giving it to a creature that does lots of attacks, it's getting extra damage on all those attacks. So I do think Shadow Blade is an okay buff spell in the right situation, especially when you have a character that can really make use of it. Someone mentioned to me, I talk about monks and monks not being very good. Someone mentioned to me where they took a Kensai monk and then they used Sharpen the Blade on a Shadow Blade to do a reasonable amount of damage. Now there were some big problems with that build. Defensively, that build, I just don't see it surviving at all. And then it had to make this huge investment into Sorcerer to be able to make use of abilities like Sharpen the Blade that could be used on a Shadow Blade. But what I do think is, if you had a caster who had Shadow Blade, and then you had a Kensai monk who took Shadow Blade as one of their Kensai weapons, then it would be a good buff for that monk. So in that situation, I could see this being quite good, and turn a character that's probably not very effective into one that is reasonably effective. But for this ability to be useful, you have to have an ally with multiple attacks around who can really make use of this weapon, and doesn't already have a weapon that's really effective. But all those things in place, an okay buff to have. The next spell I want to talk about is Phantasmal Force. Now, Phantasmal Force is a spell that's going to vary in effectiveness wildly between tables, because what can be done with this illusion really depends on the DM. But basically, you create the image of an object or a creature in somebody's mind if they fail an intelligence saving throw. If they make their saving throw, nothing happens. But if they fail their saving throw, then they have this illusion. And then what they do will depend on how they react to that illusion. Now, I've heard of DMs who just have the creature basically ignore the illusion, and then this spell is really, all it can do is 1d6 points of damage per round using your concentration, which is awful. Another thing that might happen is they might use an investigation check to try to determine that it's an illusion, which will essentially provide additional, not saving throws, they're ability checks, but additional ways to get out of this. So unlike, say, a suggestion spell that has one saving throw, this could provide multiple chances for a creature to avoid the effects. And finally, a DM might have it that this creature totally buys into the illusion and it totally affects what they do. Maybe the illusion is one of their allies looks like an enemy, so they attack them. So it could be really useful things. But there's such a wide variance on how this is dealt with. I don't really want to strongly recommend it, though it may be very effective at your table. But just a warning, it may not be very effective at your table. And again, this is one of those single target spells that if they make their save, nothing happens. And if they fail their save, they have additional ways to get out of this effect. So if we want a single target save or suck kind of spell, I would tend to go with suggestion over this spell. Now, it is possible, if you are an illusionist, and this is one of those spells that the DM is really allowing you to play with in a creative and useful way, then Malleable Illusion for illusionists might make this spell very good, because maybe their ally looks like an enemy and they attack them, and maybe they defeat them. And so then you can use your Malleable Illusion to maybe have another one of their allies look like an enemy, or any number of things that might allow this to continue to be an effective spell beyond when it normally would be. So illusionists might want to look at the spell a little more closely, especially if you have a DM who plays well with illusions and illusionists. The next spell I want to talk about is Nystul's Magic Aura. So what Nystul's Magic Aura does is you cast it on an object and then it's going to deliver false information. So maybe you take an item that's not magic and then you make it appear magic, so it might be some kind of diversion for enemies. Or maybe you take a powerful magic item and you mask it so that somebody searching for that item is unable to determine the true nature of it. Both those things, very, very circumstantial. So in the right circumstances, I could see this being really useful. Someone mentioned to me a few days ago, and no, you aren't too late for me to add this to my second level spell video, that they used it to great effect in a campaign where they were protecting a powerful artifact, and they were able to use Nystul's magic aura to help mask the fact that it was an artifact. Yeah, useful in that circumstance. Circumstantial spell. Really good in the right circumstance. But in general, I'm not going to prepare it with my wizard, and I'm probably not going to take it with my wizard unless I know those circumstances are likely to come up. The last spell I'm going to talk about is Magic Mouth. Again, a very circumstantial spell. Now, somebody mentioned to me not long ago, and this was obviously a computer programmer, on how you might use Magic Mouth as a way to trigger effects where you might be able to detect enemies and do all kinds of things. It's so complicated, I'm not even going to get into it here. In general, this spell has a 10 gold piece cost. It has a trigger that sets a Magic Mouth that's going to say something. So there are certain circumstances where you might find that useful. Maybe you're setting up a warning system or a messaging system. Magic Mouth is a way that you can do that. But in general, I'd say very circumstantial, unless you get into very complex uses of this spell. So let's get into Necromancy spells. And the first and my favorite Necromancy spell at second level is Blindness and Deafness. Because Blindness, Deafness is a non-concentration spell. So we can use this to debuff an enemy without using concentration. Now they get a Constitution saving throw, and that's not good. It is a single target spell, so that's not good. If they make their saving throw, nothing happens, so that's not good. But having it as a spell available while we're concentrating on something else as a way to debuff our enemies gives us something potentially useful to do. And blindness is a terrible condition. The other thing is this spell actually scales reasonably well, because every time we scale this spell up or cast it with a higher level slot, we're adding an additional target. So by casting it as a third level spell, we can affect 2 targets. As a fourth level spell, we can affect 3 targets. So then it's no longer a single target spell, and the chances of somebody failing their saving throw are better. So overall, I think this is a reasonably decent spell, with the obvious drawbacks of single target and targeting a not great saving throw. But there are a lot of things to like here. Good scaling, doesn't use your concentration, and the not using your concentration is the big one. The next spell I want to talk about is Gentle Repose. So Gentle Repose has 2 effects. You cast it on a corpse, and the first thing is it can't be raised as undead for up to 10 days. That's, of course, just wildly circumstantial. The second thing is that it preserves them. That 10-day duration of the Gentle Repose doesn't count against the time limits of spells like Raise Dead. So where I would find this spell to be somewhat useful, and this again is circumstantial, but something like an ally goes down and then maybe a combat's taking longer than we thought, or maybe the paladin doesn't have the Revivify spell available because they already used their spell slots on things like Smite. You could use Gentle Repose to allow a Revivify to work up to 10 days later. So now the paladin can have their long rest and then use the Revivify spell to bring up a dead ally. But in those right circumstances, it would definitely be handy. My least favorite Necromancy spell at this level is Ray of Enfeeblement. Now, Ray of Enfeeblement isn't the worst spell at second level. There are worse spells, but it's not good. It requires a to-hit roll. If you make your to-hit roll, then a creature that's hit by that has the damage of attacks based on strength halved. This will require your concentration. And then they get a Constitution saving throw at the end of each of their turns. So the chances that this is going to last more than a round or 2 are pretty low. But the duration is bad, it requires a to-hit roll, and it's single target. So those 3 things combined together make this not a very good spell in my opinion. So let's get into transmutation, and there are a lot of transmutation spells. My favorite of them is Levitate. So what Levitate does is it either levitates you or somebody else, and if they don't want to be levitated, they get a Constitution saving throw. So why do I like this spell so much? Well, versatility. Because we can use it on an enemy, and often that can take them right out of the combat. If it is an enemy that doesn't fly and relies on melee attacks, it can't do anything, and it doesn't get an additional saving throw, which again makes this very useful combined with something like Portent. And you can use it on your allies if maybe they are in dire straits, and then you can get them away from those enemies that are doing lots of damage. And because they're not moving on their own accord, it doesn't provoke attacks of opportunity. Or you can use it on yourself, and then you can levitate, and then you can throw fireballs or whatever, and creatures that rely on melee attacks and don't fly won't be able to attack you back. Now, at high levels, more and more creatures can fly, so levitate becomes less and less useful. Targeting a single creature and giving it a constitution saving throw or nothing happens isn't great unless we have some way around it, like a portent. So there are some limitations to this spell, but as a second level spell, when I'm a third level caster, being able to levitate myself, being able to levitate my allies, being able to levitate my enemies creates a lot of versatility in a spell, and when I don't have a lot of spells. So that's the kind of spell I want to use a preparation slot on for sure. And then at higher levels, I may not have this prepared anymore. The next spell I want to talk about is Dragon's Breath. So Dragon's Breath is a buff. You cast it on an ally, and then they can use their action on their turn to do their Dragon's Breath that does 3d6 damage. Now, 3d6 damage isn't a huge amount of damage, but it's more than you get with, say, a Flaming Sphere, and it is an area of effect, so you could potentially hit multiple enemies. But the big thing is, of course, then you can do it round after round, so those compile. So 3d6 becomes 6d6, becomes 9d6, becomes 12d6. Now, is 3d6 and a save for half worth the action of most of your allies? No, it's not. So as a buff on yourself or the other PCs, I don't think this is a good spell. But as a buff on your familiar, or on your phantom steed, or on a summoned creature, or on any other kind of ally that you might have that isn't overly effective, then Dragon's Breath is quite good because you're giving them a decent thing they can do on their turn every turn. The next spell I want to talk about is Rope Trick. Now, Rope Trick, if it wasn't for the fact that Leomund's Tiny Hut comes up at 3rd level, I would call this even a better spell. But as a 2nd level spell, I think Rope Trick is a pretty good way to have your party be able to take a safe short rest. And a short rest can be really useful for some parties, especially if you have warlocks and monks and fighters in the party. They're all getting all their abilities back with short rests. Druids are getting their wild shapes back as well. So there's lots of things that people get back, and you can use your Arcane Recovery to get the slot you use to make the Rope Trick back at least once. So one time per day you could use your Arcane Recovery as a way to ensure that you would get a short rest when otherwise you wouldn't. And of course, short rests are a great way for the party to heal as well. So recovering hit points, recovering abilities, all in safety, make Rope Trick a reasonably decent spell to take. Again, once we get Leomund's Tiny Hut, other than the fact that Rope Trick only takes an action to cast, for resting, I think Leomund's Tiny Hut is the better spell. But at 3rd level, Rope Trick is a great way to get that safe short rest. The next spell I want to talk about is Pyrotechnics. So what Pyrotechnics does is you target a non-magical flame. There's going to be smoke over a 20-foot radius that is heavily obscured. Now, one really nice thing about Pyrotechnics, in fact, the best thing about Pyrotechnics, is it doesn't use your concentration. So we're getting basically the effect of a fog cloud, all without using your concentration, which is great. The problem with Pyrotechnics is you have to have the non-magical flame to target. And if you don't have a non-magical flame in the middle of your enemies, then you got to figure out a way to get it there. And that might take your action. And so then this might require multiple actions to set up. Now, what I used to recommend is using your Flaming Sphere. So you would have a Flaming Sphere, throw it in the middle of your enemies, of course you would, and then you could cast Pyrotechnics on it. And that's when this was in the Elemental Evil guide. And at that time, it wasn't restricted to non-magical flame. But then they changed it so it was restricted to non-magical flame, potentially for the very reason why I liked it on a Flaming Sphere. So now it is a lot harder to use effectively. But when you have that flame in the right place, this is a non-concentration fog cloud and potential blindness, which is really good. So it's a hard spell to set up, but when the setup is done, it could work well. The next spell I want to talk about is Darkvision. So if you and your party are all of races that have Darkvision already, obviously you're not going to want this spell. But especially when you are in a party where only one person doesn't have Darkvision. So you have an elf, a dwarf, and then you got a human. Then Darkvision is really good, because you can give that human the Darkvision, and now your entire party has the Darkvision, which means now you don't have to carry a light source when you go down in the dungeon, and that can often give you away to your enemies. So then if you want to use sneaky tactics, being able to make sure that everyone has Darkvision is going to be really useful. Now, Darkvision doesn't use your concentration, so theoretically we could cast it on multiple party members if multiple party members need it. Now, because it's using a second level slot, there's going to be a limited number of slots we're going to be wanting to use at lower levels. But at higher levels, that's maybe not such a big deal. The next spell I want to talk about is Magic Weapon. So what Magic Weapon does is it takes a non-magic weapon, turns it into a +1 weapon, only uses your bonus action to cast. But it uses your concentration. So this is a buff that is going to be requiring a concentration. And it's for a +1 to hit and a +1 to damage to a weapon that's not already magical. So to begin with, this is a spell that doesn't scale at all. Because although there is the ability to cast it at higher levels for a greater effect, eventually your party's all going to have magic weapons already. So why do we want to create a +1 weapon when the character already has a +1 weapon? It doesn't do anything, right? So as it scales, so will our magic items likely. So in those cases, then it's kind of useless. And it's using a concentration, and the duration's not that great. But where this could be really useful is if you're in a super low magic campaign. If you are in a campaign where the players aren't going to get magic items, and now they're fighting creatures that are often going to be resistant to damage from non-magical weapons. So they're often resistant to that damage until you cast something like a magic weapon, and then they can bypass that resistance in addition to the bonus. So in that circumstance, a good spell. But for most circumstances, I just don't think it's a very good spell. The next spell I want to talk about is Alter Self. So Alter Self has 3 uses. Number 1, you can allow yourself to breathe underwater. That's pretty good. I mean, we're going to get rituals that allow us to breathe underwater for 24 hours, including the entire party with our 3rd level spells. But for 2nd level spells, before we have access to those 3rd level spells, this is the first spell that's going to allow us to breathe underwater. The second thing it can do is it can disguise our appearance, so it could replace, say, a disguise self spell, but it is a level higher. And then the third thing it can do is it can give you natural weapons that are really terrible. So you probably never want to use it for that. The main thing for this spell for me is the ability to get a Breathe Water spell before Breathe Water spells are available. The next spell I want to talk about is Enlarge Reduce. So with the Enlarge Reduce, you can target either a creature or an object, and then you can have it either increase or decrease in size. Now, as a buff, this isn't all that great because enlarging somebody doesn't increase their damage very much. So other than increasing the area that they cover, and that might be okay if they're, say, a reach weapon user, maybe they have the Sentinel feat, then something like being larger could have some effect on the tactics of a combat. But in terms of actually increasing their damage, it doesn't do much. Now we could potentially use it as a debuff on an enemy, but they get a Constitution saving throw and it's a single target, and the effect isn't dramatic. So those 3 things together mean that I'm probably not going to use it that way. The final thing is to use it on objects. So one thing that is always mentioned, and it's kind of the obvious use, is there's a locked door, you cast Reduce, now the door is smaller than the door frame, so then you can just move it out of the way. And that is really the most common use I hear of changing the size of objects. Remember, this is using your concentration, so you can only do it on one object at a time. But for getting by doors, then this kind of becomes a replacement for the Knock spell, in addition to some potential minor buffing abilities. Overall, none of those things are overly great. So this isn't a bad spell, but I think the circumstances where it's useful are relatively limited. So speaking of Knock, let's talk about Knock. So what Knock does is you can choose a lock or a box or a chest or a door within 60 feet of you and then have it open, whether it's locked or not. And that's reasonably useful. Sometimes there's locks you just can't get by, and then Knock would allow you to get by them. Sometimes there's locks you can't reach, and a Knock can allow you to reach them. And then there's certain locks you can't get around, like an Arcane Lock, but Knock is going to allow you to get through those as well. So we're really just talking about getting past barriers or obstacles. Not really something you're going to be using in combat. And in most campaigns, if you have a couple characters who have Thieves' Tools and Thieves' Tool proficiency, then most of the time you're not going to need Knock. But it kind of becomes this fail-safe. All else fails, you're going to use the Knock spell. Now, if you didn't have the Knock spell, is the DM going to say, well, you couldn't get past the lock, I guess our night's over? No, they usually have some other way you're going to get by it. So I don't think Knock is ever a necessary spell for you to have, but it can make certain obstacles easy. The next spell I'll talk about is Spider Climb. So Spider Climb pretty much does what you think it would do. It's going to use your concentration, lasts 1 hour, allows you to climb up the walls or along the ceilings. Now, the one thing that's not intuitive about the spell is it leaves your hands free. So you are just walking with your feet. So it's not like Spider-Man, I guess. You're just kind of walking up the wall or along the ceiling. And these have some tactical bonuses to them. Are they bonuses that I think overall weigh as well as you get from a Levitate spell? I'd say most of the time, the advantages you would get from a Spider Climb spell you could have gotten from a Levitate spell. But there's lots of advantages from a Levitate spell, like if there are no walls or ceiling, that you won't get from a Spider Climb spell. So for the most part, if you're looking for that kind of spell, I'd say just take Levitate. But Spider Climb's not a bad spell, and if it's a spell you really want, and if you're most of the time you're indoors, I don't think it's a bad spell for you to take. But I just think there is a significantly better option out there for you. The next spell I want to talk about is Earthbind. So what Earthbind is used for is there's a flying creature, you can't reach it, you cast Earthbind on it, it makes a strength saving throw, and if it fails that strength saving throw, its fly speed is reduced to 0, and it descends safely down to ground. It doesn't fall, it doesn't take damage, but it does prevent it from flying, and you can concentrate on this spell for up to a minute, and so for that minute, then that creature is now landlocked. This can be a very useful spell. I mean, you're fighting a dragon. That dragon's doing flybys and doing its breath weapon, and you have no real method to deal with it other than arrows, and maybe that's not your specialty. Then Earthbind is a way you can bring it down to the ground, just like you do in Skyrim. You have that shout that takes the dragon and brings them to the ground so you can actually defeat them. That's kind of what Earthbind does, except the strength saving throw really isn't one we want to be targeting if we're doing dragons, because dragons are going to have a high strength, but other flying creatures may not have such high strength. Now, ultimately, at some point, our party is going to be able to fly, and then Earthbind isn't useful at all. So this is not a spell I'd ever take at a higher level. At a lower level, if we're knowing that we're going to be facing flying creatures, then maybe, but it's circumstantial. This is only if there's flying creatures, we don't have good ranged attacks. So we need to bring them down to ground. And remember, single target, if they make their save, nothing happens. The next spell I'm going to talk about is Maximilian's Earthen Grasp. That enemy makes a strength saving throw. If that strength saving throw succeeds, nothing happens. If the strength saving throw fails, then you restrain them, and they take a little bit of damage, 2d6 damage. Now you have to use your concentration to maintain it, but that creature remains restrained while you maintain this ability. Now they can use a strength check to get out of it, and then you can use your action on your turn to do 2d6 damage to that enemy, which is a terrible use of your action. I mean, that's hardly better than a cantrip. So I don't really think that ability is one I would ever use, but in terms of just grabbing a creature and then restraining it, it's a single target, saving throw or nothing happens. I can't help but think that web would be a much better option here. But if you can get it to work on a single target, then the webs aren't in the way of your allies either. So there's some advantages to using this over, say, a web spell. You can also use this hand then to attack a different creature. So let's say the creature you're restraining has been defeated. Now you can attack another creature with the hand, or you can just let the original creature go and attack another creature with the hand. So we could potentially restrain different enemies with this as well. Again, we're doing single target in terms of one at a time, but potentially multiple targets over the duration of the spell. Overall, I think this spell is just far worse than web, but it's not terrible. It's still an okay spell. If you can lock in that restraint condition, it is going to be hard for them to get out of it. And that can be a game changer in a combat. So I can't say that this is a bad spell. I just don't think it's good enough of the time to warrant it being a recommended spell. The final spell I'm going to talk about today, and my least favorite transmutation spell, is Skywrite. Now, Skywrite is a spell that has a reputation as being maybe the worst spell in D&D, and I don't think it's nearly that bad. I don't think it's a good spell, but I don't think it's the worst spell. The main use for me for Skywrite is you're in an outdoor campaign. You need to talk to your allies. They're far away from you, so you cast this spell, and then you turn the clouds into 10 words that then they can read from that distance. So you can use it as a long-range communication. And because it is a ritual, it's not going to use a spell slot. That's just massively circumstantial. But I don't think it's the worst spell in the game. And remember, it's a ritual, and I'm kind to rituals because we're not using up our casting slots or our preparation slots either. Now, is this a spell I'm going to select as one of my 2 spells per level? Never. I'm never going to take Skyrite as one of my 2 precious known spells per level. But if I find it in a spell book, am I going to spend the 100 gold pieces to copy it into mine? Yep, I will. I think it's useful enough of the time to warrant that much at least. So that's my list of 2nd level spells. Are you wondering about how any spells might operate at other levels that I didn't talk about? Then let me know in the comments down below and I'll answer as many as I can. But next week we'll be talking about our 3rd level spells. Ideally, I'm hoping to get that video up on Monday, so maybe just a few days away. So I hope to see you then. Until then, I'm going to sit back and relax. And I'm going to have some fun, because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers, and I will hopefully see you Monday.